Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to rank all range DPS for Mythic Plus as they are right now in the Shadowlands beta. Now that the release date is coming closer, everyone is looking to see what class they want to main or play as an alt. This has been a highly requested topic. However, I'm spending all of my time mainly focused on healers and tanks, so I wanted to get some outside help for this one. With me is World First Raider, MDI caster, and range DPS expert Xyronic. Zyro, could you introduce yourself for those who don't know you yet?
I'm Xyronic. I've been a world first raider in Blood Legion Unlimited for the past 7 years or so. And I also play a lot of Mythic Plus content and cast the MDI.
I really appreciate having you help me with this list, since you bring so much competitive experience from these specs, not just recently, but for many years. In my previous video, I ranked things from best to worst, but for this one, you suggested a tier list. What makes you think a tier list is a better format?
I think like breaking stuff down into what's going to be meta and then what like is just barely outside of the meta but still like a good choice, like a good backup is kind of the way to do it, and you can do that in a tier list format pretty easily.
I know the factor that most people are going to care about is the damage, and we're definitely going to talk a lot about that. Damage profiles are really important too, right? Like how that damage is packed together if you're doing a lot of priority damage or mostly just spread AoE, and also how much utility the class brings to the dungeons can make a big difference too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between like Frost Mage versus a Subtlety Rogue, right? If a Subtlety Rogue is doing the same overall damage as a Frost Mage, they're going to be way more valuable because most of that damage is going into priority targets. Whether like the damage profile of different specs is really really important when you talk about like what you want to bring into a dungeon group. In general, the amount of utility options that range DPS bring outside of like the permaslow from Frost Mage and then maybe the various different like individual things that balanced druids can do, I don't think there's like too much in the way of like utility based things that range specs usually bring. Usually the utility is more focused on the melee, which is why we see like double melee be so common in push groups.
Yeah, and it's important to note that not only is everyone probably not going to be doing super high key pushing groups, but also this stuff is just beta right now and anything could happen. We're only trying to put together this list to give people an idea of how the specs are looking right now, since many people haven't gotten the opportunity to play in it. I think it's most important that you make the decision for what class you're playing based off of what you think will be the most fun, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, any skilled player could join a pug and crush the meters on pretty much any of the specs. I just don't think in a super high key pushing situation they're going to be necessarily the most viable thing.
I think the worst injustice is if you really like one spec of a DPS when another one from that same class is more popular. Do you think with the way classes work like that, where you have three different DPS specs, will there ever be a harmony with a class like Mage or Warlock or Hunter? Or do you think it'll always be everyone gravitates towards one side of the spectrum and you just see 90% of the mages play Frost or 90% of the Hunters play Marksman? Is that a balance problem? Could Blizzard fix that, or do you think it's just an inevitable meta thing that happens?
Nah, it's just a meta thing. If one spec is even like just barely better than the other ones, people are going to gravitate to that because they want to make sure they're getting every single like ounce of strength out of the spec that they play.
Agreed. Without going on too much longer, let's get to our rankings. We have 11 range specs ranked among 4 different tiers. S tier are classes that will likely be in the meta. A tier are not quite guaranteed spots, but good secondary options. B tier are for specs that are getting outperformed right now, but do have the potential if the right changes are made. Last is the C tier, with specs that need a bit more work. Let's start with Warlock, a class you play a ton. Your highest rated Warlock spec is Destro in the A tier. Initially, we talked about Destro being S, but now with some of the scaling changes, I think this is a bit more fair of a ranking, although it's somewhat in a limbo between both tiers because it's better than almost everything else.
As far as Destro goes, Destro was really kind of looking to be that fire mage type spec where it didn't really matter what the utility it brought was. It was just doing so much damage that it didn't matter. I still think like once you get into high end raid gear and you start scaling your secondaries up with gem sockets and whatnot, I think Destro can still be that spec. But until you get to the high end gear, it's just going to be really good. It's not going to be the best overall spec until you get into ridiculous gear.
Do you think as it gets later into the expansion, also it scales better with stats than other specs?
Generally speaking, yeah, almost all the Warlock specs have pretty ridiculous secondary scaling. That's why you see them. I mean, you've seen Destro with expedient gear on live right now. The only reason it doesn't get any playtime is because it's so reliant on Infernal, and Infernal's like a 3-minute cooldown. The only reason Destro is kind of making that jump to being insane on Shadowlands beta right now is because of Wilfred's, which is their legendary, which reduces the cooldown of Infernal. So you take that 2-minute 30 cooldown, which it is on live, and you can lower it to like a minute 30, a minute 40. So you go for this massive pull where Destro carries the damage, does 50k DPS overall. You do like a cooldown pull where you pull like 2 or 3 mobs, let your tank's cooldown reset. Then the Infernal's ready to go again, and they just do ridiculous damage.
Although it's here primarily for its strong damage, Warlock brings some other things to its dungeon groups too, right?
You can make Warlock work in terms of utility. They've got Fear, so they can spam Fear a mob. They've got Havoc Mortal Coil with Destro, so you can Horrify with no DR 2 mobs with Havoc. Then, of course, you get Healthstones. There are actually some gateway skips in Shadowlands, which could be useful. We haven't had gateway skips for, I think, all of BFA, so there are a couple situations where you can use a gateway skip in the place of a Rogue Shroud, but I think most push groups are going to be using a Rogue Shroud anyways.
This utility isn't unique to Destro, though. It's also shared with the other specs like Affliction and Demo. Let's do Demo next. You have Demo all the way down in the C tier. What makes it so much worse?
Yeah, Demo is it's like the redheaded stepchild of Warlock specs, and I think part of the reason you're not seeing anyone play Demo on beta literally at all is because both Affliction and Destro are pretty much top into the line of all the range specs, so there's like no reason to play Demo. One of the biggest problems with Demonology is ever since they reworked it to not have Metamorphosis, so pretty much since the beginning of Legion, it's been an entirely pet damage based spec. So pretty much all of your damage, except for like your fillers, is based off of pets. And as everyone knows with WoW, any class that has to deal with any pet macro is miserable to play. The pets just, they do their own thing all the time, and it's really tough to deal with. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some like crazy build that somebody randomly finds that does good damage because nobody's really been playing it, but I don't think it's likely.
Yeah, it all comes down to finding a good build and tuning. It's still possible that there's hope for Demonology mains, though, right? Like in terms of future balance changes for conduits or something?
Yeah, and that was actually one of the first things I saw when I looked at the Warlock conduits. Destro has like one really good potency conduit. Affliction has a couple pretty good ones, but all of Demonologies actually look like really good. So if there's any sort of tiny like scaling changes and that makes Demonology good, I think it can actually be a very good spec.
And last is Affliction, which you mentioned is up in the A tier, but definitely below Destruction. Why is that?
Affliction is more of a priority damage spec, but the problem with Affliction is that it requires some ramp up time. So if you're playing Destruction, you walk up to a pack of mobs, you hit Infernal, you hit Rain of Fire, and you're in business. You're doing your damage. But if you're playing Affliction, you need to make sure you have a certain amount of shards going into a pull. You need to agony every single mob. You need to Seed of Corruption. You need to Vile Taint. You need to start spamming Malefic Rapture. There's a whole bunch of setup time that goes into making Affliction good. And the thing is, the cooldowns don't really lend themselves well to doing damage. Darkglare isn't that good of a damage cooldown anymore after they removed Deathbolt as a talent. So there's no real insane single target burst from Affliction anymore. It's just like really, really good damage over time. I'd say it's actually probably a pretty good tyrannical pushing spec if you have other classes in your group that do good instant AoE damage to deal with the non-fortified packs. But aside from that, the overall damage is also slightly worse than Destruction, and it's definitely a lot more of an annoying to play.
Is it one of those specs where it's sort of worse in lower keys too? Like when packs die really, really fast, you do even less damage and it feels less fun to play?
Oh, for sure.
It's
It'd be miserable to play in low keys.
All right, well, next let's do Elemental Shaman. Right down next to Demo in the C tier. It seems like none of the Shaman specs have been popular lately. What's going on there?
I think the biggest problem with Ellie is that I don't think Blizzard knows what they want to do with the spec yet. They're in this like balancing limbo right now where they removed their Maelstrom. They tried to bring Fulmination back with a Lightning Shield. Realized that didn't really work out too well. Went back to Maelstrom. I don't think they've really been tuned or balanced yet. Their damage right now really isn't that good unless you're abusing the legendary bug with their shoulders, which makes your Earthquake do like 3.5 times more damage than it's supposed to do. If you remove that from the equation, their overall damage in dungeons is like, it's almost tank level of DPS. There is one interesting combination that I'm not sure what the strength of is yet, that I've seen some people using in PvP, and it could be used in PvE situations, where they have this interesting combo where they run the Necrolord ability, which puts Flame Shock on a target and makes your next Lava Burst hit all targets that have Flame Shock on them. And then they also use Ascendance, which does the exact same thing, and each one of them adds an extra lava burst. So you have this ridiculous burst, but it's every 3 minutes, so it's really not that useful. If the numbers are there, this is similar to the past couple specs we talked about. If the numbers are there, LA Shaman in terms of utility is really good, but the numbers just are nowhere near right now.
Well, a class that has recently gotten some tuning is Marksman Hunter, which you have in the A tier. Marksman seems like the standout hunter spec in the beta and virtually wasn't played at all for most of Battle for Azeroth.
Yeah, so Marksman Hunter, and I haven't played them personally myself, so most of my information is secondhand, but I think I have a pretty good grasp on what their strengths are right now. They've got Volley, which is a pretty solid 1 minute cooldown, which they can do a lot of damage during. The legendary they're currently using, it's when after they cast, I believe, a trick shotted aim shot, their next aim shot will proc 3 arcane shots. But they're also using Chimera Shot as a talent, which replaces Arcane Shot. So whenever they do this aim shot, trick shot combo, they cast 3 Chimera Shots, which is actually 6 Chimera Shots because Chimera Shot hits 2 targets. So they just do a lot of quick AoE burst damage whenever they use this combo. You know, it's a 1 minute cooldown. They have it up for pretty much every single pull, and it's just really good damage. Now the problem with that legendary is that I'm not sure, and I don't think anyone's sure whether or not that interaction is supposed to happen.
So it seems like frequent, non-cooldown reliant burst damage is what's making Marks Hunter so good right now. What sorts of utility is Hunter bringing nowadays?
They bring Binding Shot, which could be useful for tank kiting as maybe a replacement to a slow if they just need to get like a necrotic reset or some bleed reset. Utility wise, well, they have Trank Shot now again, which is pretty useful. It's not pet based anymore like it was in BFA. Outside of that, I mean, they have a pseudo immunity with Turtle that doesn't always work on everything. So they're an okay spec in terms of utility, but not one of the best.
And what about Beast Mastery Hunters? You ranked it on the B tier under Marksmanship. Why is that?
BM, I mean, when it comes to Hunter specs, it's really just about the damage, right? I don't think BM and Marksman really bring too much different to the table except for the damage profiles. And from what I've been seeing in streams of people who play Hunter, BM's just been behind. It's just one of those tuning things where if the numbers get tuned up a little bit for Beast Mastery, it could definitely be better. I mean, you see on live right now, BM has a fantastic damage profile. They have really consistent overall AoE damage, but the numbers just aren't there for them right now in Shadowlands.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Next, I want to look at mages. We have Frost Mage as our first S tier spec. Everyone's been playing it on beta. Are the slows that good, or is there something more to it?
Well, I mean, Frost always has the slow, right? You don't see any Frost Mages on live because the damage is so far behind Fire. But the slow is just like an added benefit. The good thing about Frost right now is that they have damage for literally every single pack. With the legendary they're using, the Howling Winds legendary, your Frozen Orb cooldown is like 25 to 30 seconds. It's pretty ridiculous. You have a Frozen Orb up or multiple Frozen Orbs up for every single pull, which means your damage profile over the course of a dungeon, you are always going to be doing good damage. Probably only losing to somebody like a Destro Warlock with Infernal on any pull, or maybe like a Boomkin with Enkarn. And you have all of your damage is pretty much priority damage. You play Splitting Ice, you play all of the Ice Lance, conduits, and damage boosts you can, and you are literally just Frozen Orbing, Blizzarding, and then spamming Ice Lances on whatever priority target you want to hit. So not only is their overall damage just generally good, but it's almost all priority damage.
Also, it seems like the way that you talk about it, it's good for pugs too, right? Like if you have cooldowns up for every pull, then you're way less reliant on what your tank is pulling or knowing the order, and you can just sort of blast and feel good.
Yeah.
And what about Arcane, which we're putting down in the B tier? What is it lacking right now?
I would say Arcane is one of the specs that has a lot of potential if people figure out how to play it properly. Obviously, Arcane is more of a mana battery than most of the other mage specs, so when you get access to that Prideful buff, which gives you a bunch of mana regen, you can actually just pump out 4-stack Arcane Blast and do a ton of damage. In theory, right? If the numbers are there, it could be really good. I think the problem with Arcane and also Fire as well is that Frost is just so good that nobody's really been putting any time into it, so we don't really actually know how good it could be. It's definitely behind in terms of damage, and it also doesn't have the benefit that Frost has of having, you know, major cooldowns up for pretty much every single pull, right? They're still on their Arcane Power Timer to do good damage. They're still on the Runa Power Timer. So the overall damage profile just isn't nearly as good as Frost's.
And now Fire, going from S tier in Battle for Azeroth to C tier in Shadowlands. What happened there?
So Fire, the biggest problem with Fire is that they moved the Ignite spreading as a passive benefit from mastery to being something that you now have to actively spread by hitting. Well, it's changed a few times. At first it was Phoenix Flames, I think it's now Fire Blast. You have to hit a rotational ability in order to spread your ignite, which feels awful. So you're going through your combust rotation and you hit a Fire Blast at the start of it to, proc a Pyro Blast, and then it spreads there. Then you have to wait to spread it again. And it really doesn't play that well. And on top of that, there have been numerous bugs with Fire in beta where the hot streak buffs weren't working properly. If you're a Fire Mage and you have a Pyroblast proc and you Fireball and then hit Pyroblast at the end of it and they both crit, it only recognizes one of them critting and gives you a heating up instead of a hot streak, which it makes the spec, you can't play the spec when that happens. So no one's actually probably even bothered playing it at all because you really kind of just can't play it.
Well, goodbye to our Fire Mage overlords, I guess. Next, I want to talk about Shadow Priest. This has been a really popular one whenever I'm streaming and playing with a Shadow Priest. You have Shadow Priest in the A tier. How are they looking right now?
So the Shadow Priest that I've played with and the damage that I've seen from watching streams is that they have insane potential for like mass AoE pulls. I believe they spec into Searing Nightmare and it just lets them do this ridiculous AoE burst. But the problem is it's not as consistent or as good as the AoE burst that you would get in addition to having like the focus damage from a Frost Mage or a Destrolock, or even a Boomkin for that matter. So they just have pretty good consistent overall damage, not quite as good as some of the other specs. I think it's just probably a tuning thing right now where they've pretty much reworked the spec as a whole with, changing Void Form to a cooldown and changing how the interaction with their insanity works. But yeah, I think it's just a numbers thing, and I think that, if they do see some number increases, they could see some viability in high key pushing. But for the time being, I think they're just kind of one of the secondary specs.
The only spec that we haven't covered is Boomkin. Your guildmate Gabezilla told me if I put it too high on this list, I'm going to hear from his lawyer, but you have it in the A tier. It's a little hard to judge right now because of the bugged Venthyr conduit that is causing it to do too much damage, but how do you think they're going to perform in Shadowlands?
So Boomkin's interesting, and it's hard to know too much about the actual state of the damage that they do because they've been using that bugged Venthyr conduit, which makes them pretty insane. The reason I put Boomkin in that tier is because out of all the range specs, I think they have the most utility of any of the range specs. And if they can do similar damage after all the tuning and all the numbers go live with the utility that they have, you just kind of want to have one of them in your group. I mean, the way that they are with their utility reminds me of in Legion when Boomkins kind of ran the dungeon for your group. They didn't top the meters. They didn't really do anything spectacular damage-wise, but, controlling patrols by rooting the lead mob of a pack, having Innervate for your healer, Solar Beam is insane for certain packs, having Ursals now, having knockbacks, Mass Entangle, all the things that Boomkins can do. I mean, I didn't even say trees yet. They just have so many things they can do to help your group do a key, help your tank survive, help the route of the dungeon go clean, that if the numbers are even close to the top specs in terms of damage, they're like vital for utility. They just help you complete the dungeon in more ways than other ranged DPS specs do.
That does it. All 11 ranged DPS specs ranked for Mythic Plus in the Shadowlands beta. If you enjoyed this content, I'd appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel for more informational Shadowlands content. I also want to give a big shout out to Xyronic for helping me out with this list. Where can the people find you?
If you want to yell at me for saying something wrong about your spec or tell me I'm wrong, you can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/Xyronic, or you can at me on Twitter at @LimitXyronic.
Great, and I hope you and everyone else have a wonderful day. Happy keying!